Today we are breaking down one of the most common JavaScript interview questions. What are the difference between var, let, and const? If you've ever been confused about JavaScript variables, stick around because I'll make it super easier to understand with real-world examples. Let's get started. So what is a variable? Now, a variable in JavaScript is just a container for storing data. Think of it like a box where you can store numbers, text, or even objects. For example, I will open my code editor. I will be using Visual Studio Code. My runtime, I will be using Node.js. So if you don't have Node.js installed, head over to nodejs.org and download the long-term support version for your operating system, and you can be able to follow along. Now, back in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to open this new file, index.js, which is an empty file. This is where we're going to write the code. And the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to say let. So I will declare a variable. Let's say let name equals to, and then Brian as a string. So anything between quotes in JavaScript is a string, and that's one way of declaring variables. And now I can be able to access the variable down here by just saying name. So I just want to console log the name here. Okay, so I'm going to open my terminal and I will run this using Node.js. So I'm going to say node followed by the name of the file, which is index.js, and if I run that, you can see we have Brian. So name is a variable that holds a string, right? So anything between quotes is a string. Now let's talk about var, let, and const. So the very first thing we're going to start with is var. Okay, so let's say var here. Var can we can declare variables using var before ES6 came. So ES6 came with new features of JavaScript. So one of the features of var, it's that var can be reassigned, and it's also a function scope. It's not block scope. I'm going to show you that in a minute. Okay. Alright, so let's declare a variable with var. So we can say var, and I'm going to say name equals to same. I'm going to say Brian. Done. Okay, so one of the features of var is that we can reassign var. So we can say var and name equals to maybe something like John. And this is just going to run if we try and print the name in the console. Well, you can guess what you're going to get. We're going to get John. Even though we had Brian initially, we reassigned that variable into John, right? So that's one of the features of var. Now, the second thing about var is that it is a function scope, not block scope. So for example, we can create a block. We can say if true, then I can say a var and name, or I can say value. Let me use another name. Value equals to maybe let's say x like that. Okay, so what you expect is that this var can only be accessed inside this scope here. Okay, but what is interesting is that var can be accessed outside that scope. So for example, we can just print down the value, and we can run this, and if you run that, you see we have x, and this is not a good behavior because var leaks. So you can see this value leaks outside this scope here. Okay, next we're going to talk about let. So let was introduced by ES6, and with let we can assign variables with let. That's the first thing. We can reassign a variable, but we cannot redeclare. Okay, so this is redeclaring a variable. What we did with var here, we redeclared this variable here. So with let we cannot do this, but we can reassign the variable. Okay, and also let is a block scope variable. So unlike var, which can ignores the block scope, var let does not ignore the block scope. It's a block scope variable. So if we had something like this and we defined a variable with let, we cannot access this variable outside this scope. So we're going to write some code and going to define a variable. So I'm going to say let num be equals to 10, and we can reassign this variable. So let's first of all try to reassign. I'm going to say name equals to, and maybe let's say 5 like that. So you can already see JavaScript complaining, and if I put my cursor there, you can see that we cannot redeclare block scope variable num. Okay, all right, so I'm going to remove this because that's going to cause an error if we run that. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to say num equals to and maybe let's say 5. Okay, so now this is reassigning, not redeclaring. We are now reassigning num the value of num, and here we can now console log the num. Yeah, and you can guess what you're going to get. You're going to get 5 because the initial value was 10 and we reassigned that to 5, but we cannot redeclare this. Now let's try doing something inside of our scope. So I'm going to say if true, then can now let's say let num be equals to 10, and let's try and access num outside this scope here. Now if we run this, see, we are going to get an error in node and it's saying num is not defined, even though with var we actually got the value and it was printed in the terminal here. But now with the let, you see that let is a blocked scope variable, so that means it's only accessible inside this scope here. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about the last one, which is const. So const. All right, now const is the immutable way, so it was also introduced in ES6. So the thing about const is that it cannot be reassigned or redeclared. So unlike let, which we reassigned, we cannot do that with const, and also we cannot redeclare a variable with const. Okay, also const is a block scope, just like var. We cannot access it outside its scope. All right, okay, now let's do some examples here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to say const, I'm going to say pi equals to 3.142. That's the value of pi. Now the thing with var, if we try to reassign it, so if we try to put pi to be equal to 3.14, 3 here, 3.14, and we try to console log the pi, that let me run this. Now you can see we have an error, and it's going to say that assignment to a constant variable, and the variable was pi. So this is not accepted in const. So in const we create constant variable, things that will never change. It also respects the block scope, so we can try and do something like if true. We can now define our pi inside here, and we can try to access that pi. I'm going to remove this and try to access that pi outside that scope. I'm going to run this again, node, and you can see we have an error saying that pi is not defined because it's only defined in this scope here, but outside that scope pi is not known. So that's all about JavaScript variable. Hopefully you have understood the differences between const, let, and var. And if you like this video and you found it helpful, consider liking and subscribing to help this channel with the YouTube algorithm.